The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the country club, sending crystal fragments across polished shoes and designer dresses. The sound cut through the elegant chatter like a rifle shot, and for a moment, every conversation stopped. My brother Marcus stood frozen, his hand still extended from where he'd knocked the glass from mine, his face twisted with the same disgust I'd seen growing up whenever I dared to speak. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You're embarrassing yourself, Riley, he hissed, his voice low but sharp enough to carry to the nearby tables. Just like you embarrassed our whole family when you came crawling back from Afghanistan with your tail between your legs. His fiancée, a willowy blonde named Sophia, pressed her manicured fingers to her lips, eyes wide with manufactured shock. Maybe you should leave before you ruin our engagement party completely. The words hit like shrapnel, each syllable designed to wound. Around us, the cream of Seattle society pretended not to stare while hanging on every word. I stood there in my simple black dress, the only civilian clothes I owned that seemed appropriate for such an occasion, feeling every inch the outsider they wanted me to be. My hands, scarred from roadside bombs and firefights, trembled slightly as I bent to pick up the larger pieces of glass. The country club's opulent ballroom felt like a foreign country to me, all crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths. A world away from the dusty forward operating bases where I'd spent the last 8 years of my life. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh flowers, not diesel fuel and cordite. I shouldn't have come. I knew that the moment I walked through those massive oak doors and saw the way conversations stuttered to a halt, the way eyes followed me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Growing up, Marcus had always been the golden child. 3 years older, he'd inherited our father's height and our mother's devastating smile, along with their talent for making everything look effortless. While I struggled through school, he sailed through with perfect grades. While I fought to fit in, he collected friends like trophies. When I announced I was enlisting right after high school graduation, the disappointment in their eyes was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Riley's always been the difficult one. My mother had explained to relatives who asked where I'd gone. She never quite found her place. It was easier than admitting their daughter had chosen camouflage over cocktail dresses, that she'd rather serve her country than serve at their charity galas. The Blackwood family had built their fortune in timber and real estate, generations of wealth that came with expectations and traditions. We lived in a sprawling estate in Bellevue, where the neighbors were tech moguls and old money families who measured success by the size of your yacht and the exclusivity of your club memberships. My great-grandfather's portrait hung in the foyer, stern and disapproving in his wool suit, watching over a legacy I'd never seemed destined to inherit. Marcus had followed the prescribed path perfectly. Harvard Business School, a prestigious job at the family company, and now an engagement to Sophia Whitmore, whose father owned half the waterfront in downtown Seattle. They were the perfect couple, beautiful and wealthy and utterly conventional, everything our parents had ever wanted. I had been 8 years old when I first realized I didn't fit the mold they'd cast for me. It was during one of Mother's elaborate dinner parties, the kind where she hired actual string quartets and served courses I couldn't pronounce. I'd snuck downstairs in my pajamas, fascinated by the glittering crowd, and accidentally knocked over a priceless vase while trying to get a better look. The crash had silenced the room just like tonight's broken glass, but instead of concern for a frightened child, I saw embarrassment flash across my parents' faces. Riley has always been so clumsy. Mother had laughed, her voice tight with mortification as she hustled me back upstairs. We're working on her coordination. Marcus had been there that night too, watching from the banister with 12-year-old superiority. Even then, he understood something I wouldn't grasp for years. In our family, image was everything, and I was a crack in their perfect facade. School was no better. While Marcus excelled at everything from debate team to lacrosse, I struggled to find my place. I was too tall, too awkward, too intense. Other girls my age were experimenting with makeup and gossiping about boys, but I was more interested in the military history documentaries that played late at night on the History Channel. I'd watch stories of D-Day in Vietnam, of women breaking barriers in the armed forces, and feel something stir in my chest that I couldn't name yet. My bedroom became my refuge, walls covered not with boy band posters but with maps of the world, articles about military operations, anything that spoke to the restless energy building inside me. I devoured books about combat medics and helicopter pilots, about soldiers who'd found purpose and brotherhood in service. While my parents worried about which prestigious university I'd attend, I was already planning a different kind of future. The breaking point came during my junior year of high school. I'd been struggling in calculus, staying after school for extra help, when I overheard a conversation between my parents and Marcus in the kitchen. I'd meant to ask for help with homework, but their voices stopped me at the doorway. "She's just not college material," Father was saying, his voice heavy with resignation. "We've spent a fortune on tutors and prep courses, and her grades are still mediocre at best. Maybe we should start looking at community colleges. Something more realistic." "It's embarrassing," Mother added, the ice clinking in her evening cocktail. "Rebecca Morrison's daughter got into Stanford, and the Hendersons' girl is at Yale. What am I supposed to say when they ask about Riley's plans?" Marcus, home from his first year at Harvard, leaned back in his chair with casual cruelty. "Maybe she could learn a trade. Plumbing pays well, I hear." Their laughter cut through me like a blade. I stood there in my school uniform, clutching my calculus textbook, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. In that moment, I understood that to them I wasn't just the difficult child or the awkward daughter. I was the family failure, the one who would never measure up to their expectations. That night, I sat at my computer and researched Army recruitment. The videos showed young men and women in uniform, proud and purposeful, finding strength they never knew they had. The slogan burned itself into my memory: "Be all you can be." For the first time in my life, I saw a path forward that didn't require me to apologize for who I was. The recruiter's office was in a strip mall 20 minutes from our house, sandwiched between a nail salon and a Subway restaurant. Sergeant Rodriguez was a compact woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, the kind of person who measured worth by character rather than bank statements. When I walked in wearing my school uniform, she didn't see the Blackwood name or the private school pedigree. She saw a young woman looking for direction. "What brings you here today?" she asked, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. The walls were covered with photos of soldiers in various locations around the world, faces dirty but smiling, arms around comrades who'd become family. "I want to serve," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I want to do something that matters." She studied me for a long moment, taking in the expensive uniform, the nervous energy I couldn't quite hide. "Tell me about yourself, Riley. What makes you think the Army is right for you?" I could have mentioned my grades, my extracurricular activities, the college applications my parents were pushing. Instead, I found myself talking about the restlessness that kept me awake at night, the feeling that I was meant for something more than charity luncheons.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
And country club memberships. I told her about the documentaries I watched, the books I read, the growing certainty that service was my calling. "The Army isn't easy," she warned me. "It's going to challenge everything you think you know about yourself. You'll be pushed harder than you've ever been pushed, physically and mentally. You'll be away from everything familiar for months at a time. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the dinner table conversations where I sat silent, about Marcus's easy success and my parents' barely concealed disappointment. "I'm already away from everything familiar," I said. "At least in the Army, I might find where I belong." Sergeant Rodriguez smiled then, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen directed at me in months. "When do you turn 18? 3 months, I said. "Come back then," she said, sliding a packet of information across the desk. "Read everything, talk to your family. Make sure this is what you really want. The Army will always be here, but this decision will change your life forever." I carried that packet home like a secret treasure, hiding it in my room where no one would find it. Over the next 3 months, I memorized every page, every job description, every benefit and requirement. I researched bases around the world, imagined myself in desert camouflage or dress blues, serving something bigger than myself. The conversation with my parents came the week after graduation. Marcus was home for the summer, fresh from his sophomore year and full of stories about internships at prestigious firms. The family was gathered for dinner, the dining room table set with mother's best china, when I finally found the courage to speak. "I've made a decision about my future," I announced, my voice cutting through their discussion of which universities still had openings for fall admission. Father looked up from his wine, eyebrows raised. "Oh? Have you finally decided on a school?" "I'm joining the army," I said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Mother's fork clattered against her plate. Marcus actually laughed, a sharp bark of disbelief. "That's not funny, Riley," Mother said, her voice strained. "We've talked about this. You need to think seriously about your education." "I am thinking seriously," I replied, surprised by my own calm. "I'm leaving for basic training in 6 weeks." Father's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. "Absolutely not. I will not have a daughter of mine throwing her life away playing soldier. You'll go to college like every other respectable young woman, even if I have to drag you there myself." "It's already done," I said, pulling out the enlistment papers I'd signed that morning. "I'm 18. I don't need your permission." The explosion that followed was spectacular. Father raged about family reputation and wasted opportunities. Mother wept about losing her daughter to some foreign war. Marcus sat back and watched, with the detached interest of someone observing a particularly dramatic television show. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Father finally said, his voice cold with fury. "Don't come crying to us when you realize what you've thrown away. The army doesn't want spoiled rich girls who can't handle real work." "Then I guess we'll find out," I said, standing up from the table with legs that felt steadier than they had in years. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and increasingly strained family dinners. My parents alternated between trying to talk me out of my decision and pretending I didn't exist. Marcus treated the whole thing like an extended joke, making comments about whether they issued pink rifles for princesses. The night before I left for Fort Leonard Wood, I sat in my childhood bedroom one last time, surrounded by packed boxes and empty walls. Everything I was taking fit into a single duffel bag. Everything I was leaving behind felt like someone else's life. There was a soft knock at my door, and Mother appeared in the doorway, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen her. She'd been crying, her carefully applied makeup smudged around her eyes. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to comfort her, to promise that everything would be fine, that I'd come home soon and resume the life they'd planned for me. Instead, I told her the truth. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She nodded slowly, tears starting fresh. "I don't understand it," she said. "I don't understand you, but you're my daughter, and I love you, even if I think you're making a terrible mistake." It was the closest thing to a blessing I was going to get. The bus to the airport left at dawn, and I was surprised to find Marcus waiting in the kitchen when I came downstairs with my bag. He was drinking coffee and staring out the window at the manicured gardens, still in his pajamas. "So you're really doing this," he said without turning around. "I'm really doing this." He turned then, and for just a moment, I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like respect. "You know they'll never forgive you if you fail." "I'm not planning to fail." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You never have before, but there's always a first time." Those words followed me onto the bus, onto the plane, all the way to Missouri, where the Army would either make me or break me. As the plane lifted off from Seattle, I pressed my face to the window and watched my childhood disappear beneath the clouds. Whatever happened next, I was finally free to find out who I really was. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was everything Sergeant Rodriguez had warned me it would be, and more. The drill sergeants didn't care about my family's money or my private school education. They cared about whether I could keep up with the pack runs, whether I could field strip a rifle in the dark, whether I could be trusted to watch a battle buddy's back. The first few weeks were brutal. My muscles, accustomed to tennis lessons and riding instruction, screamed in protest as we ran miles before dawn and crawled through obstacle courses in the mud. My hands, soft from years of manicures, developed calluses and cuts. My voice, trained to speak softly in drawing rooms, learned to shout commands that could be heard over gunfire. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged. In the barracks, sharing space with women from every background imaginable, no one cared about my trust fund or my family's expectations. They cared about whether I would share my care packages from home, whether I had their backs during field exercises, whether I could be counted on when things got tough. My bunkmate was a girl named Jessica from rural Alabama, whose family raised hogs and whose father worked double shifts at a chicken processing plant to make ends meet. She should have resented me, the rich girl playing at being a soldier, but instead she became my closest friend. When I struggled with weapons maintenance, she taught me with patient hands. When she had trouble with written exams, I helped her study by lamplight after lights out. "You're different than I expected," she told me one night as we polished our boots for the 100th time. "When I first saw you, I figured you were another princess who'd wash out in a week." "What changed your mind?" I asked. She grinned, her teeth white in the dim light. "You never quit. You may not be the fastest or the strongest, but you never quit trying. That matters more than anything else out here." It was the first time anyone had ever seen determination as one of my virtues, rather than my flaws. I graduated basic training in the top third of my class, earning recognition for marksmanship and leadership potential. The drill sergeant who'd been hardest on me during those first terrible weeks pulled me aside on graduation day. "I wasn't sure about you when you first got here, Blackwood," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Rich kids usually don't make it past the first month, but you proved me wrong. You've got what it takes to be a real soldier." The pride I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't based on my parents' expectations or society's approval. It was earned through sweat and blood, and countless hours of pushing past what I thought were my limits. From there, I was selected for advanced individual training as a combat medic, a choice that surprised everyone, including myself. I'd always been squeamish around blood, fainting during a biology class dissection in high school. But something about the idea of saving lives rather than taking them appealed to me deeply. The medical training was intensive, covering everything from basic first aid to battlefield surgery. We learned to work under pressure, to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. I discovered I had steady hands and a calm demeanor under stress, qualities that served me well in emergency situations. It was during this training that I met Captain Sarah Chen, a career Army nurse who would become both mentor and inspiration. Captain Chen had served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, earning Bronze Stars for her work treating wounded soldiers under fire. She was tough as nails but deeply compassionate, the kind of leader who earned respect through competence rather than rank. "Medicine in combat is different from anything you'll learn in civilian schools," she told our class during one of her guest lectures. "You'll be working with limited supplies, under enemy fire, trying to save lives while mortars are falling around you. Some of you won't be able to handle it. That's not a judgment on your character, just a recognition that this work isn't for everyone." I raised my hand. "How do you know if you can handle it?" She studied me for a moment, taking in my earnest expression and the slight tremor in my voice that betrayed my nerves. "You won't know until you're tested, but I can tell you this. The best combat medics aren't necessarily the ones with the highest test scores or the most natural talent. They're the ones who refuse to give up, even when everything is falling apart around them." Her words echoed in my mind throughout the rest of my training. When I struggled with the more complex procedures, when I doubted my abilities, I remembered that refusal to give up was something I'd been practicing my whole life. After completing my medical training, I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The transition from student to active duty soldier was jarring at first. I was now responsible for the health and well-being of real people, not training dummies. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. My first deployment came 8 months later. Afghanistan, a place that existed in my mind only through news reports and documentaries. As our transport plane descended through the mountains toward Bagram Airfield, I pressed my face to the small window and saw a landscape unlike anything I'd ever imagined. Harsh and beautiful and alien, a place where the rules of the world I'd grown up in didn't apply. The forward operating base was a small city of tents and prefabricated buildings, surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. The air smelled of dust and diesel fuel, and the sound of helicopters was constant, a mechanical heartbeat that marked the rhythm of our days. I was assigned to a medical unit responsible for treating both American forces and local civilians caught in the crossfire of a war that had been raging since before I was born. My first real test came just 3 weeks into the deployment. A convoy had hit an improvised explosive device outside the wire, and the casualties were coming in fast. The aid station erupted into controlled chaos as wounded soldiers were carried in on stretchers, their blood mixing with the dust on their uniforms. I found myself working on a young private, not much older than myself, his leg nearly severed by shrapnel. His eyes were wide with shock and pain, and he kept asking for his mother. My hands moved with a steadiness that surprised me, applying pressure to the wound while calling for surgical support. In that moment, all the training crystallized into instinct, and I knew exactly what needed to be done. "Stay with me," I told him, my voice calm despite the chaos around us. "You're going to be fine. I've got you." He survived, eventually medically retired with full honors and a prosthetic leg that would let him walk again. It was the first life I'd helped save, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the next 15 months, I treated everything from combat wounds to heat exhaustion to the psychological trauma that war inflicts on even the strongest minds. I learned to sleep through mortar attacks and to find moments of beauty in a harsh landscape. I made friends who became closer than family, bonds forged in shared danger and mutual dependence. I also learned about loss. Sergeant Martinez, who taught me to play poker and shared photos of his daughter's quinceañera. Corporal Johnson, who could fix any piece of equipment with nothing but determination and spare parts. Lieutenant Williams, who wrote poetry in his spare time and dreamed of becoming a teacher when he got home. Good people, all of them, whose lives ended too soon in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. Each loss carved something out of me, but it also added something back. A deeper understanding of what service really meant. Appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of life. A knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, even if the people back home would never fully understand the sacrifice. The letters from home came sporadically, when mail could get through. Mother wrote about charity events and society news, as if I were away at some exotic boarding school rather than a war zone. Father's letters were shorter, usually focused on business updates, and reminders that my position at the family company would be waiting when I came to my senses and returned home. Marcus wrote exactly once, a brief note that arrived 6 months into my deployment. "Still playing soldier?" he'd written. "Some of us are actually building careers out here. Sophia and I are engaged, by the way. Try not to get shot before the wedding." I'd read that letter sitting outside the medical tent, watching the sun set over the mountains, and felt nothing but pity for him. He was building a career, but I was building something more important. I was building myself into someone I could be proud of. My second deployment was to Iraq, a different kind of war, in a different kind of landscape. The desert was flatter here, more urban, with ancient cities that had seen empires rise and fall long before America was even a dream. The medical challenges were different too. More civilian casualties, more complex trauma cases that required split-second triage decisions. It was in Iraq that I earned my combat medical badge, treating wounded soldiers under fire during a complex ambush outside Fallujah. The citation read simply, "For exemplary performance of medical duties under enemy fire," but those dry words couldn't capture the reality of crawling through debris while bullets sparked off concrete overhead, of dragging wounded soldiers to safety while explosions shook the ground beneath my feet. The badge was just a piece of metal and ribbon, but it represented something more. Recognition that I belonged here, that I'd proven myself worthy of the trust my fellow soldiers placed in me. When Captain Chen pinned it to my uniform during a ceremony at the base, I thought about Marcus and his dismissive comments about playing soldier. There was nothing playful about what we were doing out here. My third deployment was back to Afghanistan, this time as a staff sergeant with my own team of medics to train and lead. The country had changed in the years since my first tour, but the mission remained the same: help people, save lives, make it home safely. I'd learned to compartmentalize the fear, to function effectively despite the constant awareness that any moment could be your last. It was during this final deployment that everything changed. We were attached to a special operations unit conducting raids against high-value targets, dangerous work that required split-second timing and absolute trust in your teammates. I'd done hundreds of these operations by then, enough that the pre-mission briefings blurred together in my memory. This one started like all the others: intelligence about a Taliban commander, a compound in a rural valley, insertion by helicopter under cover of darkness. What made it different was the children. The target building was supposed to be clear of civilians, but intelligence is never perfect. When we breached the door, we found not just enemy fighters but a family hiding in the back room. A mother, a father, and 3 children who couldn't have been older than 10. The youngest was a girl with enormous dark eyes who reminded me somehow of my sister Leah at that age. The firefight was brief but intense. When the shooting stopped, 2 enemy fighters were dead and one of our own was wounded. But it was the civilian casualties that haunted me. The father had taken shrapnel protecting his family. The mother was unconscious from a concussion. And the little girl, the one with the eyes like Leah's, had a piece of metal embedded in her chest just inches from her heart. Working on her in that dusty room, with gunpowder still hanging in the air and her mother's blood on my hands, I felt something break inside me. Not physically, but something deeper. Some last piece of innocence or faith that had somehow survived 3 deployments and countless casualties. She lived. We got her to the base hospital in time, and the surgeons managed to extract the shrapnel without hitting any major organs. But as I watched her sleeping in the recovery ward, tubes and monitors surrounding her small body, I knew something had changed forever. That night, I sat outside the medical tent and wrote a letter I'd been composing in my head for months. My resignation from the army, effective at the end of my tour. 8 years was enough. I'd given everything I had to give, and there wasn't much left. The hardest part was telling my team. These were soldiers I'd trained, men and women who looked up to me for guidance and leadership. Explaining that their sergeant was leaving felt like abandonment, even though I knew they'd be in good hands with my replacement. "Why now?" asked Corporal Davidson, one of my best medics. "You've got 10 years toward retirement. You could make Sergeant Major easy." I looked at him, trying to find words for something I barely understood myself. "Sometimes you just know when you're done," I said finally. "And I'm done." The flight home from Afghanistan was different from my previous returns. This time, there was no next deployment to prepare for, no training cycle to jump back into, just the strange reality of being a civilian again after 8 years of military life. The Seattle airport felt like another planet. Travelers moved with casual urgency, worried about delayed flights and lost luggage, problems that seemed impossibly trivial after the life I'd been living. I stood in the terminal in my dress uniform, duffel bag over my shoulder, and watched a businessman scream at a gate agent about his canceled meeting. A year ago, I might have envied his problems. Now I just felt empty. Mother and father were waiting at baggage claim, looking older and more fragile than I remembered. Mother rushed forward with tears in her eyes, embracing me with desperate intensity. Father hung back, his face carefully neutral, the way it always was when he wasn't sure how to feel. "We're so proud of you," Mother whispered, her words muffled against my shoulder. "We were so scared, but we're so proud." Proud? The word felt strange coming from her, after years of letters that carefully avoided mentioning what I was actually doing overseas. But I could hear the truth in her voice, the relief and gratitude of a mother who'd feared she might never see her daughter again. The drive home was awkward, filled with small talk about the weather and neighborhood gossip. They didn't ask about Afghanistan, and I didn't volunteer. How do you explain the weight of responsibility for other people's lives? How do you describe the feeling of lying awake at night, listening for incoming mortars? How do you make someone understand that the person who left 8 years ago no longer existed? The house looked exactly the same, a monument to stability and tradition. My room had been preserved like a shrine, my old photos and trophies gathering dust on shelves I'd outgrown long ago. I stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in my own childhood. That first week home was the hardest. I'd wake up at 05:00 out of habit, then lie in bed staring at the ceiling because there was nowhere I needed to be. The silence was oppressive after years of constant noise, helicopters and generators and radio chatter. I found myself jumping at unexpected sounds, my body still primed for threats that no longer existed. The nightmares started on the 4th night. Fragments of memory mixed with imagination. The little girl's eyes, the weight of a wounded soldier in my arms, the sound of mortars walking across the compound. I'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. Mother tried to help, in her own way. She arranged lunches with old friends from high school, most of whom were now married with children and careers in marketing or finance. They asked polite questions about my time in the service, their eyes glazing over when I gave equally polite non-answers. We had nothing in common anymore, these people I'd grown up with. They lived in a different world, one where the biggest crisis was a delayed promotion or a failed relationship. Father was more direct in his disappointment. 8 years. He said one morning over breakfast, his voice heavy with accusation. 8 years you could have spent building something real. Your brother is already a partner in the firm, you know. He's accomplished more by 30 than most people do in a lifetime. I saved lives, I said quietly. You played with guns in the desert, he shot back. Now what? You're 30 years old, with no career, no prospects, no future. Was it worth it, throwing away everything we gave you? I wanted to argue, to explain what those 8 years had meant to me, what I'd learned about myself and about service and about the kind of person I wanted to be. Instead, I just nodded and went upstairs to my childhood room, where I sat staring out the window at manicured gardens that had never known war. The job search was humiliating. My military experience counted for nothing in the civilian world, or at least nothing that mattered to HR departments in glass towers. I had skills in trauma medicine and leadership, but what employers saw was a gap in my resume and a lack of relevant experience. The interviews were exercises in translation, trying to explain how coordinating medical evacuations under fire might qualify me to manage office logistics or pharmaceutical sales. We're looking for someone with more traditional business experience, was the polite rejection I heard over and over. What they meant was someone whose leadership experience came from managing budget reports, rather than life and death decisions. The Veterans Affairs Office was supposed to help, but the counselor assigned to my case was overwhelmed and overworked. Have you considered going back to school? She suggested during our brief meeting. There are programs for veterans, ways to get your degree and start over. Start over! As if the last 8 years of my life were a mistake to be corrected rather than an accomplishment to be built upon. Marcus, meanwhile, was thriving. His engagement to Sophia had been the social event of the season, covered in the society pages with photos of them looking perfectly beautiful and perfectly shallow. He'd been promoted to senior partner at the family firm and had bought a penthouse downtown with views of Elliott Bay. When we saw each other at family dinners, he treated me with the casual condescension of someone who'd always known he was right. Still looking for work? He'd ask, cutting into his perfectly prepared steak. Maybe it's time to be realistic about your options. The mailroom at Blackwood Industries is always hiring. The worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. I was 30 years old, living in my childhood bedroom, with no clear direction and no prospects on the horizon. The confidence I'd built during my military service was eroding daily, worn away by rejection letters and condescending interviews, and the growing certainty that I had made a terrible mistake. 3 months after coming home, I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown, laptop open to yet another job search website, when I overheard a conversation at the next table. Two women in their 40s, both wearing business suits, discussing a mutual friend who'd recently returned from military service. "It's so sad," one of them was saying. "She just can't seem to adjust to normal life. I mean, what did she expect? You can't just disappear for years and expect the world to wait for you." "Exactly," the other woman agreed. "And honestly, what skills do you really learn in the military that translate to the real world? Following orders and shooting guns? That's not exactly executive material." I closed my laptop and left without finishing my coffee, their words echoing in my head. Maybe they were right. Maybe I'd been naive to think that military service was valuable, that the leadership and decision-making skills I'd developed under extreme stress would mean something in civilian life. The depression crept in slowly, like fog rolling off the water. At first, it was just the feeling of being directionless, of not knowing what came next. But gradually, it deepened into something more dangerous. Days when I couldn't summon the energy to get out of bed. Nights when I lay awake, wondering if anything I'd done in the military had mattered at all. Mother noticed, of course. She'd find excuses to check on me, bringing cups of tea I didn't want, and making small talk that felt like sandpaper against my nerves. She meant well, but her concern only reinforced my sense of failure. I was supposed to be taking care of other people, not being taken care of. "Maybe you should talk to someone," she suggested one afternoon, settling into the chair beside my bed like she was visiting an invalid. "Dr. Peterson has been our family physician for years. I'm sure he could recommend a good therapist." A therapist? Someone who would listen to me explain how I'd gone from saving lives in a war zone to being unable to find a job managing inventory at a sporting goods store. Someone who would nod sympathetically and prescribe medication to help me adjust to a life I wasn't sure I wanted. "I'm fine," I told her, the lie coming easily. "Just tired." But I wasn't fine. I was drowning in plain sight, surrounded by people who loved me but couldn't understand what I was going through. The gap between who I'd been overseas and who I was expected to be at home felt unbridgeable. 6 months after coming home, Marcus announced his engagement party. It would be held at the Seattle Yacht Club, he explained over dinner, with all the right people in attendance. Politicians and business leaders, old friends from Harvard, and new clients from the firm. The kind of event that would establish him and Sophia as a power couple worth watching. "You'll come, of course," he said, but it didn't sound like an invitation so much as a command. It's important for the family to show unity, especially with some of the firm's biggest clients attending. I almost said no. The thought of spending an evening surrounded by people who saw me as the family disappointment, the failed daughter who'd wasted her potential on a pointless war, was almost unbearable. But something in Mother's expressions stopped me, a desperate hope that her children might finally find their way back to each other. "I'll be there," I said, and immediately regretted it. The weeks leading up to Marcus's engagement party blurred together in a haze of preparation and growing dread. Mother had insisted on hiring a personal stylist, a woman named Vivian, who spoke in breathless superlatives and seemed genuinely excited about the challenge of transforming me into what she called engagement party appropriate. The irony wasn't lost on me that it took a professional to make me look like I belonged in my own family. Shopping for the event felt like preparing for a mission, except the enemy was my own reflection and the battlefield was Nordstrom's formal wear section. Vivian pulled dress after dress, each one designed to minimize what she delicately called my military bearing, and emphasize the femininity I'd apparently lost somewhere between basic training and my third deployment. "You have such strong shoulders," she said, holding up a navy blue sheath dress that looked like it belonged in a boardroom. "We need to soften that line, make you look more approachable." She paused, studying my posture with the intensity of a battlefield surgeon. "Have you considered working with a deportment coach? There are ways to modify your walk, make it less purposeful." I stood there in my underwear, surrounded by mirrors that reflected a stranger back at me. The woman in the glass had scars on her arms from shrapnel, calluses on her hands from weapons maintenance, and a network of fine lines around her eyes from squinting through desert sun. She looked like someone who'd seen things, done things, survived things. Vivian wanted to hide all of that behind silk and pearls. The final selection was a black cocktail dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. It was elegant, understated, and completely erased any evidence of the life I'd lived for the past 8 years. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the ghost of the girl I'd been before I enlisted, the one who'd been destined for charity galas and country club luncheons. "Perfect," Vivian declared, clasping her hands together with satisfaction. "You look like yourself again." But that was the problem. I didn't want to look like myself again. I wanted to look like the person I'd become, the woman who'd earned her place through service and sacrifice. The dress felt like a costume, and wearing it felt like betraying every soldier I'd served alongside. The week before the party, I found myself driving aimlessly through the city, avoiding the house and the constant reminders of my uncertain future. Seattle had changed while I was gone, new buildings reaching toward the sky, old neighborhoods gentrified beyond recognition. The coffee shops where I had studied in high school had been replaced by artisanal boutiques selling $30 candles and organic skincare made from ingredients I couldn't pronounce. I ended up at Golden Gardens Park, watching ferries cross Elliott Bay while joggers and dog walkers navigated the paths around me. The water was steel gray under cloudy skies, and the wind carried the salt scent of the Sound mixed with the diesel exhaust from shipping containers stacked like building blocks at the port. A group of teenagers was playing volleyball on the beach, their laughter carried on the breeze. They looked impossibly young to me, all energy and possibility, probably planning for college or summer jobs or weekend parties. I tried to remember being that age, but it felt like looking at someone else's life through frosted glass. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, my old bunkmate from basic training. She was stationed at Fort Carson now, married to another soldier, and expecting her first child. Her message was brief but warm. "Thinking of you today. Hope civilian life is treating you well. Miss having you watch my 6." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. How do you tell someone that civilian life feels like exile? That you miss the simplicity of knowing your purpose, even when that purpose involved dodging mortar rounds and treating sucking chest wounds? That you'd trade all the safety and comfort of home for one more day of feeling like you mattered? Instead, I typed back, "Miss you too. Give my love to Thompson." Thompson was her husband, a good soldier and a better man who'd make an excellent father. They'd found their place in the world, built something together that made sense. I envied them that certainty. The drive home took me through downtown, past the glass towers where Marcus worked, and the trendy restaurants where Sophia probably had lunch with her society friends. Traffic was heavy, filled with people heading home from jobs that paid well and mattered to someone. I sat at a red light, watching pedestrians cross the street with purpose and direction, and felt like an observer in my own life. At dinner that night, the conversation inevitably turned to the upcoming party. Sophia had been spending increasing amounts of time at the house, planning details with Mother and treating our home like her personal wedding venue. She was beautiful in the way that money and good breeding produced, all sharp cheekbones and perfect teeth, but there was something cold in her eyes that reminded me of the glacial lakes we'd trained around in Alaska. "I've seated you at table 12, she announced, consulting her phone where she kept detailed spreadsheets of the guest list. "It's a lovely table, right near the windows overlooking the water. You'll be with some of Daddy's business associates and their wives. Very accomplished women who I think you'll find fascinating." The dismissal was expertly delivered, wrapped in politeness but clear in its intent. Table 12 was where you put the family obligations, the people who had to be invited but didn't quite fit anywhere else. I had been relegated to the children's table, except the children were all successful adults with actual careers and accomplishments. "Riley's accomplished too," Mother said loyally, though her voice lacked conviction. 8 years in the Army is nothing to sneeze at." Of course, Sophia agreed with a smile that never reached her eyes. Though I imagine it must be difficult to relate to civilian life after so long in such an environment. Military people often struggle with the transition, don't they? The question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut while maintaining plausible deniability. She wasn't insulting me directly, just acknowledging what everyone already knew, that I was damaged goods, a cautionary tale about the dangers of straying too far from the prescribed path. Marcus said nothing, but I caught the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth. He was enjoying this, watching his fiancée dismantle me with the same casual efficiency she probably brought to planning charity fundraisers and country club events. "I'm sure I'll manage," I said evenly, though my hands were clenched in my lap hard enough to leave marks. "I'm sure you will," Sophia replied sweetly. "After all, adaptability is supposed to be a military strength, isn't it?" That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering why I'd agreed to attend this farce. The smart thing would be to develop a sudden illness, some excuse that would let me avoid the humiliation without causing a scene. But something stubborn in me refused to back down. I'd faced down Taliban fighters and treated wounded soldiers under fire. I could survive one evening with Seattle's social elite. The morning of the party dawned gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest weather that matched my mood perfectly. I spent the day in a state of nervous energy, unable to settle on any activity for more than a few minutes. I tried reading, but the words swam on the page. I attempted to watch television, but everything seemed trivial and meaningless. Finally, I went for a long run through the neighborhood, pounding out my anxiety on familiar streets that felt increasingly foreign. When I returned, sweaty and slightly calmer, I found Mother waiting in the kitchen with coffee and the kind of concerned expression she'd worn throughout my teenage years. She was dressed in her party attire already, an elegant wine-colored dress that complemented her silver hair and made her look younger than her 62 years. "Are you nervous about tonight?" she asked, pouring me a cup of coffee without being asked. "Should I be?" I countered, though we both knew the answer. She sighed, settling into the chair across from me with her own cup. "Your brother? He's not always the most sensitive person. And Sophia, well, she comes from a very traditional background. They might not understand what you've been through, what you've accomplished." It was the closest she'd ever come to acknowledging that my military service might actually be worth something, and I felt an unexpected surge of gratitude toward her. "I don't need them to understand," I said. "I just need to get through tonight, without embarrassing anyone." "Oh, sweetheart," she said, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "You could never embarrass us. We're proud of you, even if we don't always know how to show it." The words were meant to be comforting, but they highlighted everything that was wrong with my situation. They were proud of me, but they didn't understand me. They loved me, but they didn't know who I'd become. I was their daughter, but I was also a stranger in their house. I spent the afternoon getting ready with the kind of methodical preparation I'd once reserved for combat missions. Shower, hair, makeup applied with hands that barely trembled despite the anxiety churning in my stomach. The black dress fit perfectly, transforming me into someone who looked like she belonged at society events. The woman in the mirror could have been any of Marcus's friends, polished and appropriate, and completely unremarkable. Mother had lent me her pearls, a family heirloom that had belonged to my grandmother and her grandmother before that. They felt heavy around my neck, weighted with history and expectations. In Afghanistan, I'd worn dog tags, simple metal stamps that identified me if the worst happened. These pearls served a similar function, marking me as a member of a tribe I wasn't sure I wanted to belong to anymore. The drive to the yacht club was tense, filled with last-minute instructions from Mother about which topics to avoid and which people were important enough to remember. Father drove in characteristic silence, his jaw set in the expression he wore during difficult business negotiations. I sat in the back seat like a child being taken to a school function, watching the familiar streets of Seattle slide past the windows. The Seattle Yacht Club sat on the shore of Lake Union like a monument to privilege and tradition. Built in the early 1900s, it was all dark wood and brass fittings, the kind of place where deals were made over scotch and cigars, where membership was inherited rather than earned. As we pulled into the circular drive, I could see the other guests arriving, stepping out of luxury cars and walking toward the entrance, with the casual confidence of people who'd never doubted their place in the world. The valet who took our car was probably younger than me, working his way through college or saving money for something that mattered to him. He handled father's BMW with practiced efficiency, but I caught him glancing at the other vehicles in line: a Bentley, 2 Mercedes, a Tesla that probably cost more than most people made in a year. I wondered what he thought about events like this, whether he saw them as aspirational or ridiculous. The club's main dining room had been transformed for the occasion, all white linens and crystal chandeliers, with enormous floral arrangements that probably cost more than I'd made in a month as a sergeant. The windows looked out over the lake, where sailboats bobbed at their moorings and the city skyline gleamed in the distance. It was undeniably beautiful, but it felt as foreign to me as the mountains of Afghanistan had 8 years ago. Guests were already mingling, champagne glasses in hand, voices rising and falling in the particular rhythm of cocktail party conversation. I recognized many of the faces from society pages and business magazines, the kind of people who appeared at charity galas and political fundraisers, whose names carried weight in boardrooms and country clubs. They moved through the room with practiced ease, air-kissing and making small talk with the fluency of a shared language I'd never learned to speak. Marcus and Sophia held court near the windows, surrounded by a circle of admirers who laughed at their jokes and complimented Sophia's dress and the engagement ring that caught the light like a small star. They looked perfect together, she in ivory silk that probably cost more than my car, he in a tuxedo that had been tailored to fit his broad shoulders and easy smile. When they saw us approach, Sophia's face lit up with the kind of radiant smile she'd probably practiced in mirrors. "You look absolutely lovely," she gushed, taking my hands in hers as if we were close friends instead of reluctant family members. "That dress is perfect on you." Very classic, very appropriate. The word, appropriate, hung in the air like a small insult wrapped in a compliment. She was acknowledging that I'd managed to dress the part, at least, even if everything else about me remained questionable. Marcus kissed my cheek with brotherly affection that felt performed for the audience around us. "Glad you could make it, sis. I know civilian life keeps you busy." It was a joke, of course, since everyone knew I had nothing but time on my hands, but delivered with a smile in front of his friends, it sounded almost kind, like gentle teasing between siblings, rather than a reminder of my unemployed status. "Congratulations," I said, because it was expected. "You both look very happy." "We are," Sophia replied, beaming up at Marcus with the kind of adoration that probably photographed well. "It's such an exciting time. The wedding planning, the honeymoon in Tuscany, setting up our new home. Everything is just falling into place perfectly." She described their future with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that things would work out exactly as planned. Private schools for their future children, summers at the family compound in the San Juan Islands, charity work with the right organizations. It was a life mapped out in advance, secure and predictable and utterly conventional. "And what about you, Riley?" asked one of Marcus's friends, a man I vaguely remembered from Harvard whose family owned half the fishing fleet in Alaska. "What are your plans now that you're back?" The question was delivered with polite interest, but I could see the curiosity behind it. Everyone wanted to know what happened to the family rebel, whether she'd learned her lesson and was ready to rejoin civilized society. "I'm exploring my options," I said, the phrase I'd practiced for exactly this kind of moment, vague enough to sound intentional, positive enough to deflect pity. "How wonderful," Sophia said brightly. "There are so many opportunities for someone with your background. I'm sure you'll find something that suits you perfectly." The pause before background was expertly timed, a moment that suggested she'd been about to say something else before settling on the diplomatic choice. Everyone in the circle smiled and nodded, as if this conversation was perfectly normal, instead of a polite interrogation designed to establish exactly where I fit in their hierarchy. I excused myself as soon as I could manage it without seeming rude, claiming a need for the ladies' room but really just desperate for a moment away from their curious stares and careful questions. The yacht club's restroom was as elegant as the rest of the building, all marble and gold fixtures, with hand towels that were probably changed after each use. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting mother's pearls and trying to recognize the woman looking back at me. She looked successful, this woman in the expensive dress with the perfect makeup. She looked like she belonged at events like this, like she'd never spent nights on watch in a forward operating base or treated shrapnel wounds in a field hospital. The transformation was complete, but it felt like wearing someone else's skin. When I returned to the dining room, dinner was being served. I found my assigned seat at table 12, which turned out to be exactly what Sophia had promised. A collection of business associates and their wives, all perfectly pleasant people who treated me with the kind of polite interest reserved for distant relatives at family reunions. The woman to my right was married to a commercial real estate developer and spent most of the first course describing their recent trip to wine country. The man to my left worked in private banking and seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my military experience, though his questions revealed that his knowledge of the Army came mostly from movies and news reports. "It must have been incredible," he said over the salmon course. "Getting to see the world, serving your country, very noble. And the chimaso e theorio, leadership experience must be valuable in civilian careers." I agreed that it was valuable, though recent experience suggested otherwise. We talked about the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life, a conversation I'd had dozens of times since returning home. He offered to pass my resume along to some contacts in the healthcare industry, genuinely trying to be helpful, and I thanked him with appropriate enthusiasm. But even as I made polite conversation and smiled at their stories about European vacations and children's accomplishments, I felt increasingly disconnected from the evening. These were good people, successful and kind and generous with their advice, but they lived in a different world from the one I'd inhabited for the past 8 years, and the gap between their experiences and mine felt unbridgeable. The speeches began during dessert, Marcus rising to thank everyone for coming and to express his gratitude for the support of family and friends. He was a natural speaker, comfortable with attention, and skilled at saying exactly what his audience wanted to hear. He talked about building a future with Sophia, about the importance of family and tradition, about carrying forward the values that had made their family successful. "I'm especially grateful," he said, his eyes finding mine across the room, "to have my sister Riley here tonight. She's just returned from 8 years serving our country overseas, and we're so proud to have her home safe." Polite applause rippled through the room, the kind of respectful acknowledgement reserved for military service. A few people turned to look at me, smiling and nodding with approval. It should have been a nice moment, a public recognition of my service. Instead, it felt like being put on display, the family's token veteran trotted out for patriotic purposes. I smiled and raised my glass slightly in acknowledgement, playing the part I'd been assigned. But I could see the calculation behind Marcus's words, the way he'd used my service to enhance his own image as a supportive brother and patriotic American. It was skillfully done, turning my presence from a potential embarrassment into a positive reflection on his character. After dinner, the party moved to the club's terrace, where a band played jazz standards and couples danced under strings of lights that reflected off the dark water of the lake. I found myself standing at the railing, watching the boats bob at their moorings while conversations swirled around me like currents in a river. Father appeared beside me, scotch in hand, looking out over the water with the satisfied expression of a man who'd successfully navigated another social obligation. "Nice evening," he said, though it sounded more like a business assessment than a personal observation. "Very nice," I agreed, because it was expected. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the lights of the city shimmer on the water. Then he cleared his throat, the way he did when he was about to deliver something important. "Marcus mentioned they might have a position opening up in the company," he said carefully. "Nothing glamorous, but it would be a start. Administration, maybe coordinating with our government contracts. Your military background might actually be an asset there." It was the first time anyone had suggested my service might be valuable rather than something to overcome, and I felt a flutter of unexpected hope. But it was quickly dampened by the realization that this was charity, a job created for the family failure, rather than earned through merit. "That's generous," I said neutrally. "Think about it," he said. "You can't drift forever, Riley. At some point you need to build something, create a life that makes sense. The military was fine for what it was, but it's time to move forward. Move forward. As if the past 8 years had been a detour rather than a destination. Time that needed to be recovered rather than experience that could be built upon. But I nodded and promised to consider his offer, because arguing would only confirm their belief that I wasn't ready for the real world. The evening was winding down, guests beginning to make their polite departures, when Sophia found me still standing at the railing. She'd changed from her cocktail dress into something more casual but equally expensive, and her cheeks were flushed with champagne and success. "I hope you enjoyed yourself tonight," she said, settling beside me with the careful grace of someone who'd been trained in deportment since childhood. "It means so much to Marcus to have family here supporting him." "It was lovely," I said, because it was easier than the truth. She studied me for a moment, her blue eyes calculating in the light from the strings overhead. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about exploring your options. I might have some ideas that could help." "Oh? Well, there are so many opportunities for someone with your background in the nonprofit sector. Veteran advocacy, maybe working with military families. The pay isn't much, of course, but it could be very fulfilling, very meaningful work." The suggestion was delivered with the kind of bright enthusiasm people used when proposing activities for troubled children. Meaningful work. The consolation prize for people who couldn't succeed in the real economy. I could see myself in her vision, the earnest veteran helping other broken soldiers, grateful for any work that acknowledged my service while keeping me safely contained in a world that didn't threaten her understanding of how things worked. "That's thoughtful of you," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "I have some contacts in that world," she continued, warming to her theme. "People who really understand the challenges veterans face, who know how to channel that experience into something positive. I could make some introductions, if you'd like." She meant well, I realized. In her worldview, she was being helpful, offering to connect me with appropriate opportunities that matched my diminished circumstances. The fact that those opportunities were designed for people who needed help rather than people who had value to offer wasn't malicious on her part. It was simply how she understood the natural order of things. "I appreciate that," I said, and I meant it, even though the offer felt like a small death. The drive home was quiet, all of us wrapped in our own thoughts about the evening. Mother commented on how well everything had gone, how lovely Sophia had looked, how proud she was of Marcus for organizing such a successful event. Father grunted occasional agreement, his attention focused on the dark roads leading home. I sat in the back seat and watched Seattle slide past the windows, thinking about the evening and what it had revealed about my place in the world. I'd played my part well enough, been appropriately grateful for the recognition, and interested in the opportunities offered. But underneath the performance, I felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been carved away and replaced with polite emptiness. Back at the house, I changed out of the black dress and hung it carefully in my closet, where it looked like evidence of someone else's life. The pearls went back into Mother's jewelry box, and I scrubbed off the makeup until I looked more like myself again. But even without the costume, I felt like I was playing a role, pretending to be someone I wasn't sure how to be anymore. I sat on my bed in pajamas and bare feet, staring out the window at the manicured grounds that had been my playground as a child. The security lights illuminated the garden paths and the swimming pool, the tennis court where I'd taken lessons I'd never wanted, the greenhouse where Mother grew orchids that required constant attention and perfect conditions to survive. It was a beautiful prison, this life I'd been born into and was apparently destined to return to. Safe and comfortable and completely predictable, with clear rules about what was expected and what was acceptable. I could see my future stretching out ahead of me. The nonprofit job Sophia would arrange, the gradual acceptance back into society, the eventual marriage to someone appropriate who wouldn't mind that his wife had once played soldier in foreign wars. It was everything I'd been running from when I enlisted, and now it felt like the only option left. The military had given me purpose and identity, but that life was over now. This was what came next, learning to be grateful for charity and calling it opportunity, accepting diminished expectations and calling it realistic. I was still awake when dawn began to lighten the sky outside my window, thinking about Captain Chen and the lessons she'd taught about refusing to give up even when everything was falling apart. But this wasn't a battlefield where determination could overcome impossible odds. This was civilian life, where the rules were different and the victories were measured in salary figures and social standing rather than lives saved and missions accomplished. The phone rang early while I was still lying in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to summon the energy to face another day of job searches and polite rejections. Mother's voice carried up the stairs, right with the kind of forced cheerfulness she used when she was worried about something. "Riley, dear, could you come down? There's someone here to see you." I pulled on a robe and made my way downstairs, expecting to find one of Mother's friends with another helpful suggestion about my future, or perhaps someone from the yacht club who'd forgotten to mention an opportunity the night before. Instead, I found a woman in her 40s wearing a crisp business suit and carrying a leather briefcase that had seen better days. "Miss Blackwood?" she said, extending her hand with a firm grip that reminded me of military bearing. "I'm Sarah Martinez from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I apologize for the early hour, but I wanted to catch you before you started your day." She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and there was something in her manner that suggested she understood things that other civilians didn't. Mother hovered in the background, clearly curious but too polite to ask direct questions about government business. "Is there somewhere we could speak privately?" Martinez asked, glancing around the formal living room with its antique furniture and oil paintings of long-dead Blackwood ancestors. I led her to Father's study, a room lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive desk that had belonged to my grandfather. She settled into one of the wingback chairs and opened her briefcase with practiced efficiency. "I'll get straight to the point," she said, pulling out a manila folder thick with documents. "Your name came up in connection with a special initiative we're launching. We're looking for veterans with specific qualifications and experience, and your service record suggests you might be exactly what we need." She spread several documents across the coffee table between us. Official forms with government seals and classifications I recognized from my military days. My DD 214 was there, along with commendation letters and performance evaluations I'd forgotten about. "What kind of initiative?" I asked, leaning forward to study the papers. "We're establishing a new program to support transitioning veterans, particularly those with combat experience and medical training. The position would involve case management, crisis intervention, and coordination with multiple agencies. It's challenging work, and the pay is competitive with private sector positions." She quoted a salary figure that was significantly higher than anything I'd been offered in the civilian job market, with benefits that included health insurance and retirement contributions. But more important than the money was the way she described the work. Meaningful, challenging, using skills I'd actually developed rather than asking me to pretend they didn't exist. "Why me?" I asked. "There must be thousands of veterans with similar qualifications." Martinez smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from anyone in weeks. "Your record is exceptional, Ms. Blackwood. 3 deployments, combat medical badge, consistently outstanding performance evaluations. But more than that, you have something we can't train: the ability to connect with people who are struggling, to understand what they're going through, because you've been there yourself." She pulled out another document, this one bearing the signature of someone high up in the VA hierarchy. "The program is being fast-tracked due to the increasing number of veterans returning from overseas deployments. We need people who can start immediately, who don't need months of training to understand the challenges our clients face." It sounded too good to be true, which made me suspicious. In my experience, opportunities that seemed perfect usually came with hidden costs or impossible requirements. But Martinez seemed genuine, and the documents looked legitimate enough. "What would be required of me?" I asked. "Initially, a 6-week training program in Washington, D.C. to familiarize you with VA procedures and protocols. After that, you'd be assigned to a regional office, probably here in Seattle given your local connections. The work involves direct client contact, coordinating with other agencies, and occasional travel to outreach events." She paused, studying my expression carefully. "I should mention that this isn't a typical government job. You'd be working with veterans who are in crisis, people who are struggling with everything from homelessness to PTSD to substance abuse. It can be emotionally demanding work, and the success rate isn't always what we'd like it to be." The warning was clearly meant to discourage people who weren't serious about the commitment, but it had the opposite effect on me. After months of interviews for jobs that seemed designed for people without ambition or purpose, here was work that actually mattered, that required the kind of skills I'd spent 8 years developing. "When would you need an answer?" I asked. "The training program starts in 2 weeks," Martinez said, checking her watch. "I know it's short notice, but that's the nature of government timelines. If you're interested, I can have the paperwork processed within a few days." I looked down at my service records spread across the coffee table, at the documentation of a life that had meant something, that had made a difference in ways that couldn't be measured in profit margins or stock portfolios. For the first time since coming home, I felt something other than resignation about my future. "I'm interested," I said, and meant it completely. Martinez smiled and began gathering up the documents. "Excellent. I'll need you to complete some additional paperwork, undergo a security clearance update, and provide references from your military service. The process moves quickly once it starts, so be prepared for a busy couple of weeks." She handed me a business card and a thick packet of forms, then stood to leave. "Ms. Blackwood, can I ask you something?" I nodded. "What made you decide to leave the military?" "Your record suggests you were on track for significant advancement." It was a question I'd been asked before, by well-meaning friends and curious relatives, but coming from Martinez, it felt different. She wasn't judging my decision or trying to understand where I'd gone wrong. She was asking as one professional to another, recognizing that leaving had been a choice rather than a failure. "I was ready for a different kind of service," I said finally. 8 years was enough. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Sometimes knowing when to transition is the most important skill of all. I think you'll find this work rewarding, though it's different from military medicine." After she left, I sat in Father's study, surrounded by government forms, and feeling more hopeful than I had in months. This wasn't charity or a consolation prize. It was a job that required my actual qualifications, that valued my experience rather than asking me to overcome it. Mother appeared in the doorway, curiosity finally overcoming her discretion. "Everything all right, dear?" She seemed very official. "It was about a job," I said, gesturing to the paperwork scattered across the table. "A good job." "Oh, wonderful!" Mother's relief was audible. "Doing what?" "Working with veterans who are transitioning back to civilian life. Crisis intervention, case management, that sort of thing." I could see her processing this information, trying to fit it into her understanding of appropriate careers for Blackwood daughters. It wasn't what she'd hoped for, certainly nothing like Marcus's trajectory through Harvard and the family business, but it was respectable work that used my military background in a positive way, and that was more than she'd dared hope for in recent months. "That sounds very meaningful," she said carefully. "Will it require travel?" "Some. There's training in Washington, D.C. first, then I'd be based here in Seattle." She nodded, already mentally adjusting to the idea of having a daughter who worked for the government, rather than a nonprofit or not at all. It wasn't the future she'd envisioned, but it was a future, which was more than we'd had yesterday. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and medical examinations, security clearance updates, and reference checks. The government moved with surprising efficiency when it wanted to, and I found myself impressed by the thoroughness of the process. This wasn't a make-work position created to help struggling veterans feel useful. It was a real job, with real responsibilities and genuine qualification requirements. The hardest part was telling Father about my decision. He'd clearly been hoping I would accept his offer of a position with Blackwood Industries, and my choice to work for the government instead felt like another rejection of family expectations. "It's honest work," he said finally after I'd explained the opportunity and my decision to accept it. "Though I still think you're selling yourself short. You could have a real career in the private sector, build something significant. But this felt significant to me in ways that profit and loss statements never could. I was going to use my medical training and leadership experience to help people who were facing the same challenges I'd struggled with since coming home." For the first time since leaving the military, I felt like I was moving towards something rather than just away from everything I'd lost. Marcus's reaction was more predictable. "Government work," he said with the kind of dismissive tone he might use to describe food poisoning. "Well, I suppose it's steady. Good benefits, hard to get fired." Not much room for advancement, but then again, advancement was never really your thing. Sophia was more diplomatically encouraging, offering congratulations that sounded almost sincere, and asking questions that demonstrated she'd done some research into VA programs. She seemed relieved that I'd found something appropriate, work that would keep me busy and productive, without challenging anyone's assumptions about where I belonged in the social hierarchy. The night before I left for Washington, D.C., I packed my single suitcase with the kind of methodical preparation that had become second nature during my military years. The training program would last 6 weeks, after which I'd return to Seattle to begin my actual assignment. It felt like the beginning of something important, though I wasn't sure yet what that something might be. I stood at my bedroom window, looking out over the gardens where I'd played as a child, thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment. 8 years ago, I'd left this house as an 18-year-old girl who didn't know where she belonged. Now I was returning as a woman who'd found her purpose, or at least the next step toward finding it. The military had taught me about service and sacrifice, about leading people through impossible situations, and making decisions when lives hung in the balance. But it had also taught me about the cost of that service, the invisible wounds that followed soldiers home from war zones. Now I had a chance to use those lessons to help other people navigate their own transitions, to be the support system I'd wished for during my own difficult months of readjustment. As I closed my suitcase and set it by the door, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving Afghanistan: anticipation for what came next. Tomorrow I would fly to Washington, D.C. and begin training for work that mattered, that required everything I'd learned about myself and about serving others. It wasn't the life my parents had planned for me, but it was the life I'd chosen for myself. For the first time since coming home, that felt like enough. The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, striking the marble floor with a sound like breaking promises. Fragments scattered across polished shoes and designer dresses, each piece catching the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. The elegant conversation died instantly, replaced by the kind of silence that follows unexpected violence. Marcus stood frozen, his hand still extended from where he'd knocked the glass away, his face twisted with familiar contempt. "You're embarrassing yourself, Riley," he hissed, voice cutting through the yacht club's refined atmosphere like shattered crystal. "Just like you embarrassed our whole family when you came crawling back from Afghanistan with your tail between your legs. But something had changed in the 2 years since I'd started working for the VA. The words that once would have sent me spiraling into self-doubt now bounced off me like rain on armor. I'd spent 24 months helping combat veterans rebuild their lives, watching broken soldiers discover strength they didn't know they possessed. I'd seen miracles happen in government offices and crisis centers, witnessed the transformation that comes when someone finally finds their purpose. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority I'd learned from dealing with suicidal veterans and hostile family members, "I think we need to talk about what's really happening here." The crowd around us leaned in despite themselves, drawn by the promise of family drama at Seattle's most exclusive venue. Sophia pressed her manicured fingers to her lips, blue eyes wide with the kind of shock that photographs well for society pages. She'd planned this evening down to the smallest detail, choreographed every moment to showcase their perfect life, and I was threatening to disrupt her carefully constructed narrative. "There's nothing to discuss," Marcus said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You've made your choices, and we've all had to live with the consequences." I bent to collect the larger pieces of broken glass, my movements deliberate and calm. 2 years of crisis intervention had taught me the value of controlled responses, of refusing to escalate situations that were already volatile. But it had also taught me when to stand my ground. "You're right," I said, straightening with crystal fragments in my palm. "I have made choices. I chose to serve my country for 8 years. I chose to come home and rebuild my life instead of wallowing in self-pity. And I chose to spend the last 2 years helping other veterans do the same thing." The words carried across the terrace, reaching the edges of conversations that had supposedly resumed but were actually just sophisticated eavesdropping. I could see the calculation in Sophia's eyes, the way she was already planning damage control for whatever scandal might emerge from this confrontation. "Helping other veterans," Marcus laughed, but the sound was hollow. "Is that what we're calling it?" Last I heard, you were a glorified social worker, making government wages. Last I heard, I replied evenly, you were managing Daddy's money and calling it building an empire. The insult landed with surgical precision, striking at the one weakness Marcus had never been able to overcome, the knowledge that everything he'd accomplished had been handed to him. His face flushed red above his perfectly knotted tie, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike me. Instead, he stepped closer, using his height advantage to loom over me the way he had when we were children. At least I'm not pretending that playing therapist to broken soldiers is somehow noble. Face it, Riley, you're exactly where you belong. Cleaning up other people's messes because you're too damaged to create anything worthwhile yourself. The tall words were designed to cut deep, to find the insecurities I'd carried since childhood, and twist them until they bled. But something strange happened as I listened to his attack. Instead of pain, I felt a kind of clinical detachment, as if I were observing someone else's family drama from a safe distance. You know what, Marcus? I said, my voice carrying further than I'd intended. You're absolutely right. I am cleaning up messes. Yesterday I talked a 30-year-old Marine out of eating his gun. Last week I helped a homeless Army Ranger find housing and treatment for his PTSD. 2 months ago, I convinced a female helicopter pilot that her life was worth living after she'd been sexually assaulted by her commanding officer. The terrace had gone completely quiet now, the kind of silence that descends when people realize they're witnessing something more significant than ordinary family squabbling. Even the jazz band had stopped playing, musicians frozen with instruments half raised to their lips. So yes, I continued, I clean up messes. I take broken people and help them remember who they used to be, help them build new lives from the pieces they have left. And you know what I've learned from doing that work? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop him. I've learned that the only people who think service is weakness are people who've never served anything larger than themselves. I've learned that real strength isn't inherited or purchased, it's earned through helping others when there's nothing in it for you. And I've learned that the most broken people often become the strongest, once they figure out how to put themselves back together. A murmur ran through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. These were Seattle's elite, people who prided themselves on their charitable giving and civic involvement, and my words were striking uncomfortably close to home. How many of them had ever done anything that didn't ultimately benefit themselves? Sophia stepped forward, her smile bright and desperate. Perhaps we should. The sound cut through her words like a blade through silk, low and rhythmic, growing stronger with each passing second. The distinctive thrum of rotor blades beating the air, unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time in combat zones. People began looking up, scanning the darkening sky over Lake Union. The sound was getting closer and louder, until conversation became impossible. Glasses rattled on tables. The strings of light swayed in the downdraft. Then we saw it. A Black Hawk helicopter, dark against the sunset, approaching the yacht club with the kind of precision that spoke of military training and serious purpose. It circled once, rotors washing over the terrace like mechanical thunder, before settling into a hover above the club's manicured lawn. What the hell? Marcus started, but his words were lost in the noise. The helicopter touched down with practiced ease, its landing gear settling onto grass that probably cost more per square foot than most people's homes. The rotors continued turning, but at idle speed, and through the cockpit windows I could see figures in military uniforms preparing to disembark. The crowd pressed against the terrace railing, everyone straining to see what was happening. In all the years the Seattle Yacht Club had hosted society events, nothing like this had ever occurred. Black Hawk helicopters didn't just drop out of the sky at engagement parties, not unless something extraordinary was happening. The aircraft's side door slid open, and 3 figures emerged. 2 were in army dress blues, their uniforms crisp and formal despite the helicopter ride. The third was a woman in civilian clothes, but something about her bearing screamed military officer even without the uniform. They walked across the lawn toward the club with the kind of purposeful stride that made crowds part automatically. The woman in civilian clothes was carrying a leather portfolio, and there was something about her expression that suggested this wasn't a social call. Riley Blackwood?" She called out as they reached the terrace steps, her voice cutting through the noise and confusion with practiced authority. The entire party turned to stare at me. 300 of Seattle's most influential people, all watching as military personnel called my name at my brother's engagement party. I felt a flutter of panic, wondering what could possibly require this kind of dramatic intervention. "That's me," I said, stepping forward through the crowd that parted like water before me. The woman smiled, and suddenly I recognized her. Colonel Patricia Hayes, someone I'd met during my VA training but hadn't seen in over a year. She was the kind of officer who made things happen through sheer force of will and competence, and her presence here meant something significant was occurring. "Ms. Blackwood," she said formally, though her eyes held warmth, "I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but time is of the essence. We need to speak with you immediately regarding a matter of national importance." National importance. The words hung in the air like smoke, transforming the evening from social embarrassment to something entirely different. I could see the calculation in Marcus's eyes, the way he was trying to process this development and figure out what it meant for his carefully constructed worldview. "Of course," I said, my training kicking in automatically. "What do you need?" Colonel Hayes gestured toward the helicopter, its rotors still turning in slow, hypnotic circles. "We have a situation developing that requires your specific expertise. Multiple veterans in crisis, coordinated incidents across 3 states. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs has authorized the formation of a rapid response team, and your name was at the top of our list." She opened the portfolio and showed me documents bearing official seals and classifications I recognized from my military days. Crisis intervention protocols, deployment orders, and authorization for emergency travel. "We're mobilizing now," she continued, raising her voice over the helicopter noise. "The team assembles in Colorado in 6 hours. Lives are at stake, and we need people who can handle multiple crisis situations simultaneously while coordinating with local law enforcement." I stared at the documents, my mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just a job opportunity, it was a chance to use everything I'd learned in service of something that actually mattered. But it also meant leaving immediately, walking away from this party and this confrontation and this entire life, without looking back. "I'll need to pack," I said. "Already handled," Colonel Hayes replied, gesturing toward one of the uniformed soldiers. "We've coordinated with your supervisor. Your essential gear is being loaded onto the aircraft now." The crowd was watching this exchange with the kind of fascination usually reserved for television dramas. The society pages would be full of speculation tomorrow, theories about what could possibly require military intervention at a yacht club engagement party. I turned back toward Marcus and Sophia, both of whom were staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not contempt or pity, but something closer to awe. The family failure, the damaged veteran who couldn't find her place in civilian society, was being summoned for a mission of national importance. "I have to go," I said simply. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Riley, wait, I didn't know." "You didn't know because you never asked," I interrupted, not unkindly. "You assumed that because I wasn't following your path, I wasn't following any path at all." I handed the broken glass fragments to a passing waiter, then reached behind my neck to unclasp Mother's pearls. "Give these back to her," I told Sophia, pressing the necklace into her manicured hands. "Tell her I said thank you for everything, but I won't be needing them anymore." Colonel Hayes was already walking back toward the helicopter, her team falling into step behind her. I followed, leaving behind the elegant terrace and the shocked faces, and the life that had never quite fit me anyway. As we approached the aircraft, she leaned close to speak over the rotor noise. "I should warn you, this assignment is dangerous. We're dealing with veterans who've reached the end of their rope, some of whom have military training and access to weapons. There's no guarantee we can resolve these situations without casualties." "I understand," I said, climbing into the helicopter's cabin. "There's something else," she continued as the aircraft lifted off. "This operation is being fast-tracked through emergency channels. Success could lead to permanent assignment with the crisis response team. Failure." She shrugged. "Let's just say failure isn't an option." Through the helicopter's windows, I could see the yacht club shrinking below us, the terrace full of people staring up at our departure. The lights of Seattle spread out in all directions, a glittering carpet that had once represented everything I was supposed to want. Now it just looked small. "Colonel," I said as we banked toward the mountains, "what exactly are we flying into?" She handed me a tablet loaded with briefing materials, incident reports, and threat assessments. 3 coordinated barricade situations. Veterans with PTSD, all former special operations, all threatening suicide while holding family members hostage. Local law enforcement is out of their depth, and FBI negotiators haven't been able to establish meaningful contact. I scrolled through the files, recognizing the patterns even before reading the psychological profiles. These weren't random incidents, they were cries for help, from people who'd been trained to solve problems with violence and had run out of other options. "They're not trying to hurt their families," I said, looking up from the tablet. "They're trying to make someone pay attention." Colonel Hayes smiled grimly. "That's exactly what we hoped you'd say. Think you can talk them down?" I thought about the Marine I'd counseled out of suicide the week before, the helicopter pilot who'd found hope after months of despair, the countless veterans I'd helped navigate the impossible transition from warrior to civilian. Each success had taught me something about the language of trauma, the way damaged people communicated when words weren't enough. "I can try," I said. The helicopter swept through the mountain passes, carrying us toward a situation that would either prove my worth or end my career. But for the first time since leaving the military, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Behind us, the lights of Seattle faded into distance, along with everything I'd once thought I needed to be happy. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, and the possibility of failure, but also the chance to save lives, to use everything I'd learned in service of something larger than myself. The girl who'd once whispered stop in a kitchen full of broken glass had become a woman flying toward crisis with the tools to make it stop. And that felt like victory enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.